So what I was going to talk about is a little more in depth about where that data is coming from that Nathan talked about, and some of the challenges we have with storing it, and really what's driving the data growth, and are we keeping all of it? Why are we keeping all of it? Pieces like that. So this is the IDC data. I did this slide about 2010, I'm guessing, and really what it was is just to show you the kind of cubic volume of what's happening in the data. And the real takeaway here is not so much, if 40 zettabytes is the right number. The takeaway here is just the vast amount. And to give you an idea of what a zettabyte is, if we were to try to store a zettabyte on flash today, it would cost us $3.4 trillion to buy and deploy that flash.
It also takes 2 years.
Well, it doesn't exist, right? That much flash doesn't exist. But if you could find it, it would cost you that. And then you would have to deploy that in 3 million racks. If you were to do that with hard disk, it'd be $125 billion. It would cost, or I think it's 100,000 racks. What's the number there? And then if you were to do it, 200,000 racks. And if you were to do that with tape, it'd be 8 billion. But a zettabyte is a massive amount of data. And we're talking 6, 10, 15, 20 zettabytes of data. So when you think about a zettabyte, even though Nate showed it with zeros, physically it is just a massive amount of data. It takes up a lot of space, a lot of power. And where that data is coming from is places like this. This is one of our customers. It's the University of St. Louis, or the University of Washington in St. Louis. And just 6 of their cows generates a terabyte of data. They have a lot of cows, but each 6 generates 1 terabyte. And then they keep this data forever, right? Because in their mind, it's part of a study. And they're going to keep it, and they're going to keep migrating it forward and use it again and again and again. We do a lot of work in the video and entertainment business, and it's probably one of our primary vertical markets. And as a matter of fact, we have some people out here that are going to speak later today about this exact space. And today we're in what we call the high definition there, full HD. That's the most common television set that people are using. That's the most common broadcast stream that's out there. 4K television is on the horizon, and you can buy a 4K TV at Costco for under $2,000. When you look at Peter Jackson, who did The Hobbit, he uses a RED camera. A RED camera is a 4K camera. It's a native 4K camera. He shoots with 24 of those cameras. He keeps them running all of the time because he might just catch something that he wants to put into his movie, right? So he's catching all of this data and keeping all of this data for possibly a movie in the future, right? His next camera will be the RED Weapon. It's a 6K, 100 frame per second camera. And again, he'll have 20 of them or more running all the time. And he'll keep all of that data. This is a slide, actually, I first saw this, and I think, Fred, I didn't see where you sat there yet. First time I saw this slide, Fred did it 4 or 5 years ago. And there was an interesting thing that I gleaned out of it. Fred was talking about this, the Web 2.0 guys and where all this data is moving around. But the real takeaway I had here was this idea of the connected device, and that basically the Internet of Things is really starting to come up. The amount of devices that are out there, the things that are connected to the Internet that are generating data is growing very, very fast. And what we see is this. This is a little bit of an older slide, but we see that the rate of the Internet of Things is growing faster than the actual social media or the human-generated data. So the rate of increase of machine-generated data is growing faster. And so we see this idea that the Web 2.0 guys and the social media things, there's tons of cell phones out there, there's tons of people taking pictures, I'm generating data as a person, but now also the devices that I have, the things in my car, the airplanes that fly, the security cameras on the building, all of those are generating data. They're doing it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So today you can get a genome scan for about $1,000. If you compress that genome scan down completely, you get it down to about, I think it's 780 megabyte. If we did a genome scan of the population of the United States, it'd be 217 petabytes of data fully compressed, right? No longer is it life assurance, it's kind of an annuity policy, but that's a different point to what we would do there. A 2011 HiSeq 2000 scanner generates 20 terabytes a month. A modern scanner today is 8x that. The resolution of the scanner keeps going up. The speed of the scanner goes up so they can scan more. The cost of the scanner goes down. In the security space, when we look at a city like the city of Riverside in California, they have on average 1,000 cameras. If the cameras are high resolution, they're going to generate 105 gigabytes per day. Take that and multiply it by 1,000, multiply it by a couple of months or a couple of years, and you have a massive amount of data. The 4K video that I was talking about, as you stream that in, it's 4.25 terabytes per hour of data. And here's an interesting one. This was one that I thought was very, very interesting because it's almost the opposite of what we think about, which is we usually collect data. We then analyze, mine the data, and create a smaller subset of the data. That's usually the workflow. Geospatial happens to be a different workflow in most cases. They rain down about 5 terabytes of data every day. So off the birds come 5 terabytes. But the product that they produce and send out to their customers is around 80 terabytes. So they're always bringing in new data and creating more data, adding it on, sending out a new data set. So Visa, this is something that you can think about from a why do we collect, why do we keep this data? Visa is always trying to figure out if you're going to default on your credit card. And there's some interesting things in what they found why you would default on your credit card. So the first thing is you stay in a hotel within 10 miles of your primary home. You have charges from your lawyer on your credit card. You buy kitchen equipment, and you buy a television. They believe you're going to default on your credit card soon. So what they're going to do is, of course, raise your interest rate, lower your spending cap. What they're actually finding is you're having a divorce, right? So they have 5 signatures of default, and one of them happens to be divorce. They don't care that you're getting divorced. They care about their spending. But they actually know that you're getting divorced. So this data, this idea of mining this data for these very weird kind of things is kind of an interesting point. And the more data we have, the easier we can find these things out. And this is one of my favorite ones. We were talking about wine last night with Steve. There's Steve. I guess it's on my left, but Robert Parker there is a famous wine taster. If you bought wine and you get a recommendation from Robert Parker, it's usually a pretty good recommendation. And then there's Dr. Orly Ashenfelter, and he's a PhD. I think he's in Philadelphia. And he doesn't taste wine, but he predicts the value of wine very well. And how he does it is he looks in the past, and he says, well, today's weather in Burgundy or Bordeaux matches this year. So in other words, he tracks it back, and he says, in the spring we had this much rain. In the summer we had this much rain, and this was the temperature. During harvest was this much rain and this much. And that matches 1933. And 1933 had good grape. And so from good grape, we make good wine. Now, you'd think that the guy who tastes the wine is the better person. But when you compare the accuracy of the long-term retention of each one of these wines that these guys predicted which one would be the best, Orly is much, much better because he's doing it with data. He's never tasted the wine, but he's done it with the data. Now, if we take that and we apply it to what these guys are doing here, these are vine nerds out of Napa, California. And again, wine is an interesting world. It's a very expensive world when you think about just growing grapes and turning it into fermented juice. But it costs millions of dollars if you lose your crop. Because the crop itself wasn't, it's the lost profit, right? You still have a business to run. You have no product to produce because you don't have any grapes. So you want to get that grape off the vine as quickly as possible. And the way to do that usually is by watering it. Now, in some areas you can't water your grape, but in Napa, California, you can. And so what these guys do is they actually put sensors on the vine. And then they heat up the vine and they measure the flow of water in the vine. And they tell you if your vine needs water or not. Now, the old practice was the vineyard manager would look out on the grapes and see that the grapevines are wilted and decide it's time to water. And most likely he would do a light watering and get the thing. These guys basically show the opposite is true. Water deeply, water less often. You get the grape off the vine faster, you make better wine. And they're just driving that with data. So here's some pieces of data that are out there, and it's an interesting thing that the USDA, and I think about the geospatial world, and the USDA has film back to 1950 that's undigitized. If you really look at that, the value of that being in a digital world would be enormous. So they'll probably be digitizing that, and you can think about that resolution of that film. When they digitize it, how much data it's going to generate. Because it's 3 or 4 flights a year, it's over the same areas, and they're looking at the cropland. They're looking at how much vegetation, how green it is, all the different pieces of that. We look at the square kilometer array in the southern hemisphere. The raw data rate off that kilometer array is going to be 700 terabytes a second. Now, they're going to filter that down quite quickly, but just the raw rate is very, very high. this was a scary one in some respects, that China expects to have of home sensor data 100 zettabytes by 2030. And the other interesting one about data, when we look at data and we're talking about, how do we do things so fast with data, this Geico one really struck me, which is when you call Geico for an insurance quote, they can have a quote after they get your information, they can have a quote to you within 100 milliseconds. And the reason they can do it is they generated the quote last weekend. So they generate a quote for everyone in this room and everyone in the United States every year, or every weekend. They generate that quote. So when you call, they have a quote sitting there. And that's this idea where HPC and big data are starting to meet and come together. So one of the things when I look at data and the amount of data we're creating, this is where tape tends to play when you talk about those petabytes of data that you need to store. And the reason tape plays so well there is it's low cost, it's low power. It has great density. It has a very long shelf life, right? In the library, outside the library, tape libraries deploy for 12 plus years. Tape technology deploys for 5 to 7 years, right? It's removable, one of the points that Nathan made, and it's highly, highly reliable. And when we look at those workflows that really work well for tape, here are a couple of them right here. We have media and entertainment studio production. And when I think about studio production, this is film-based or movie-based or television show-based. And it's where we collect a bunch of assets, we produce content right then. Once that season is over or that movie is completed, we push all of that data into the archive. We may come back later and repurpose it, but it's now becoming colder and colder data, so it's pushed into the archive. You can think about animations like Shrek and things like that. When Shrek 2 is complete, and they're going on to How to Train Your Dragon, Shrek 2 is not on spinning disk. It is off into the archive. Oil and gas research is the same way. The idea that you drill a hole, drop a sensor down into the ground, and thump that ground, you may not drill for oil there next week. You may drill for oil there 10 years from now. But now that there's a subdivision there, you can't go back and thump that ground. So all these are good workflows for tape. And they work really well because you know when the data goes cold and it goes off into the archive. We do have these places where we get into this, even though it's not so much of an HSM, we get these systems where we have an archive disk and an archive tape. And these are good examples are here are daily shows. Sporting shows are one of the best. Major League Baseball keeps 2 seasons of every baseball game on disk. All the other seasons are off on tape. And the reason they do that is because when they're on air and when they're actually in live production, if they want to pull up a highlight or another cut from somebody else, their database, which is actually called Diamond, their database can go to that archive, pull it, and get it ready to play within a few seconds. That's not a place where tape plays well. All the rest of it is in the archive, in the tape archive. And so when the season ends and they want to repurpose a bunch of data and make a highlight reel about home runs, they're pulling from that archive, that tape archive. Geospatial data is the same kind of idea here. When you look at geospatial data, you have a time vector and you have a GPS vector. Those two need different retrieval rates. So a lot of that information is stored on disk. And then we have Web 2.0 applications like photo sharing sites. So how do we improve today's archive? First is open standards. I really believe in open standards. If you asked me that question 10 years ago, I would be, oh, no, not, and especially open source code. But this is really starting to resonate. And the point here is how many versions of Unix are there out there today? Right? I can remember when there was at least 24 or 25 flavors of Unix. We used to port our software to every one of those. Today, Linux is the dominant Unix platform, and it really isn't even Unix, but it is kind of the dominant player in that space. We really want, when we're talking about archive, when we're talking about long-term storage, we still want nearly instant access to it. There is this idea that when you talk about tape to customers and you say, here's your cost footprint, here's your density and all these things, the first question the novice gives you is, how long does it take for me to get my data back? And then to Nathan's point, we need online and offline copies. We need different types of media, and we need to reduce our maintenance cost. So what do we need to do there? The first one is we need the power footprint of tape and the performance of disk. And that's kind of a hard sell, right? Because when you think about tape, it's one of the most power efficient medias you can have because it's not using any. It's sitting on a shelf, right? We need long-term deployment. Most disk subsystems are out for about 3 years. We need 5 plus, 7, something like that. We need enterprise data scrubbing on this archive so that the archive is healing itself, taking care of itself. We need end-to-end data checking. And we need some level of disaster recovery. We need to scale out beyond 200 terabytes into the petabytes. And most importantly is we need very low cost, because this is data that may not ever be accessed, but you don't know the value of it, right? So you need to keep it forever because you're going to monetize it someday. So next up is David Feller, Senior Director of Product Management, and he's going to talk to you about some of the solutions that we have for those exact problems. Thank you.